All right. Well, welcome everyone to our regular webinar series. I am James O'Connell. I'm the Director of System Planning at ESIG. We are a membership-based nonprofit organization committed to providing our members with objective information, resources, and network opportunities in support of the energy transition. And we do this in a number of ways through our workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working groups, task force activities, and a number of technical resource materials, which I'm hopeful that you have seen over the recent past year. Our workshops and webinars are open to everyone, so please feel free to register at any time on the ESIG website. If you're new to ESIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear today, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. And you can find us on the web at www.esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. I guess that's X now. Our next in-person workshop will be in Austin, Texas, March 17th to the 20th of 2025. And I sincerely hope that you can join us. More information, again, is available on our website at esig.energy under events. Now, before we begin, let's go over some logistics for the webinar today. So please note that all participant lines will be muted during the webinar, and this just helps us manage distractions. So for the Q&A, we'll be using Slido at slido.com. So please go to slido.com and enter the code ESIG14. The instructions are also at the bottom of the screen and posted in the chat here. We plan to reserve 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A and hope to conclude at exactly the top of the hour. Additionally, an email with a link will be provided once the video has been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to any of the unanswered questions that we didn't get through today. So the topic for today and the speaker. So today we'll be fortunate to hear about the DOE's recently released National Transmission Planning Study. It's a comprehensive multi-year effort led by the US DOE's Grid Deployment Office in collaboration with National Renewable Energy Lab and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Now, as the resource mix changes, as we start to see exponential growth, as we see the impacts of weather, the importance of transmission is becoming more evident. We're talking both about intra and especially interregional transmission. However, there continues to be very limited movement in the planning for the identifying of and investing in the type of transmission that we will certainly need. So this study helped provide valuable insights into the future of the US electric transmission system, and it really underscores the importance of coordinated planning and the need for innovative tools and processes to find those credible paths to ensure a reliable, resilient, and cost-effective power system. We really do hope that this webinar will help you understand that critical role transmission will play in our energy future. A little bit of our speaker, Dr. Yamit Lavi is a technical advisor at the US DOE Grid Deployment Office, where she oversees a portfolio of projects focused on expanding interregional transmission to accelerate decarbonization while ensuring system reliability. She has over a decade of experience in the industry and holds a PhD in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon. We're very excited to have her here, and I will turn it over to her shortly. So once again, please use Slido with the event code ESIG14 to ask your questions. All right, I will turn this over to you, Dr. Lavi. Thank you.
Thanks, James, for that great introduction. Yes, so yeah, today we'll be discussing our National Transmission Planning Study. And as James said, my name is Yamit Lavi, and I'm a technical advisor here at the Grid Deployment Office. So just gonna give a quick overview of what I'm gonna discuss today. So first I'll go over the NTP study background. So what exactly is the National Transmission Planning Study? And I'll get into some high-level details of the principal findings of the study. And then how is GDO actually going to use the study in the future, and what sort of movement are we making in making these results more actionable? And then we'll discuss relation of the NTP study with other interregional planning efforts that you may have heard about recently, as well as then we'll get into the questions at the end. But before we get started, I just want to give a quick overview of who we are at the Grid Deployment Office. So GDO is part of the Undersecretary for Infrastructure at the DOE, And as our name suggests, we are focused on the deployment of critical infrastructure needed for reliability, resilience, and the shifting needs of our electricity system. And we focus on 3 lines of work. One is ensuring resource adequacy by supporting critical generation resources, expanding wholesale electricity markets, and engaging in those markets. And we're also catalyzing the development of new and upgraded high capacity electric transmission lines and improving distribution systems nationwide. And this is all with the goal of preventing outages, enhancing resilience, and ensuring a reliable and affordable electric grid. Now we'll get into some of the study background. As James just mentioned, the NTP study was published last month on October 3rd, and you can find the study on our website, on DOE's website, linked here, and you can have access to them as soon as they send out the slides. And we also had a public webinar on October 16th, and the recording is available as well. So if you wanted to get into more detail than perhaps I go over today, I highly recommend checking out the public webinar recording as well. So just to give a quick overview of some of the very high-level findings of the NTP study. So first, we found that improving interregional transmission can enhance grid reliability, particularly in response to extreme weather events. So we're able to move power from resources from where it's being generated to and available to where it is needed during high stress events. And we also found that a substantial expansion of the transmission system throughout the entire contiguous US delivers the largest benefits to consumers and can save the nation $270 to $490 billion through 2050, which translates to approximately $1.60 to $1.80 in system cost savings for every dollar that we spend on transmission. And we also find that expanding transmission enables the grid connection of new generation products, which can balance the variability of wind and solar resources and to accommodate growing energy demands, all while maintaining system reliability and energy affordability. And in the NTP study, we identify these high opportunity transmission interfaces or hot interfaces, which represent potentially beneficial transmission capacity expansion between regions, which are found across many different future power system scenarios. And we'll get into all of this in a bit more detail later on in these slides. So yes, this was a partnership between the National Renewable Energy Lab and the Pacific Northwest National Lab with the Grid Deployment Office. And this work builds on a lot of past projects and expertise at NREL and PNNL, along with the direction of DOE's Office of Electricity, as well as the Grid Deployment Office. And throughout the NTP study, we had a lot of broad stakeholder engagement. So this project, the NTP study, started in March of 2022. So we were working on this for about 2.5 years. So throughout that entire time, we spent a lot of time engaging with the public and engaging with industry experts. So we had the lab seek feedback through a technical review committee. We also had consistent outreach to industry planners through WEC as well as EIPC. We also had various subcommittees where we tested model data and input assumptions that was negotiated with the labs and industry. So we were constantly getting feedback from the industry and from the public to make our study as robust and as relevant to stakeholders as possible. So we had the labs really engaged robustly with a technical review committee to seek their individual input. So we had 4 public meetings as well as several plenary TRC meetings, as well as they constantly engaged with several modeling subcommittees, government subcommittee meetings, and land use and environmental exclusion subcommittee meetings. And this was all with the goal of really getting the best possible data into the model and making our results as applicable to the industry as possible. So what is the NTP study? What are we trying to solve here? So due to rising demand, um, increasingly diverse energy resources, and the need for enhanced resilience, the nation needs significant investments in new interregional transmission capacity to meet the variety of these needs. And there's really been a fragmented approach to some of these existing planning efforts, as we see from various queue reforms and other rulemakings. We are rarely seeing a consideration of interregional solutions. And existing planning analysis and tools may not be capturing the full value of larger grid scale interregional connections or be able to answer questions about the operational reliability of larger systems. So we really need to start considering national scale strategies and interregional transmission to meet our needs while reducing costs by expanding transmission. So to start filling in these gaps, the overarching goal of the NTP study is to understand the role of transmission across many different possible futures as the power system changes and becomes more diverse. And this study is innovative because of the way it links several long-term and short-term system models and considers a range of transmission build-out scenarios, demand growth scenarios, emissions targets, and sensitivities around resource technology availability and costs. And this study is meant to inform planning processes for both regional and interregional transmission with national focus strategies. So I've spent some time already covering what the study does do, but I want to emphasize again to focus on those objectives I just talked about. The NTP study links several types of modeling and analysis to test many different transmission scenarios that lie outside of existing utility planning practices. But I do want to emphasize that the NTP study does not intend to replace existing regional and utility planning processes. And any transmission opportunities or resulting examples I'm going to present today could be areas for further exploration, but they don't represent all possible solutions, and nor should they detract from alternative transmission projects already included in regional plans. And the NTP study also does not go into detail of recommending any specific lines or their routes, locations, environmental impacts, or plans of service. As I've mentioned a few times before, the NTP study links several types of modeling and analysis, and this slide shows the general setup for the methods for the study. It's broadly divided up into two sections, the zonal resolution and the nodal, more granular resolution. So the zonal resolution looks at long-term scenarios through 2050, which allows us to look at a lot of different scenarios of the future and do a lot of modeling on different policies, costs, and technologies. And then we move into the more nodal resolution modeling. We do a more deep dive on several of the scenarios with 2035 transmission portfolios. So we're able to ask questions in this nodal modeling, in this more detailed modeling, about the viability of the grid in the future. And altogether, this brings a lot of different modeling and analysis, looking for a low cost and reliable grid that gives us, and this approach gives us a robust look at what the grid might look like in the future. So specifically, we're looking at 4 different transmission build-out scenarios. The first is the limited transmission build-out scenario. You can think of this as more of the business as usual if we don't remove any barriers to transmission deployment. So this limits transmission expansion to within planning regions and limits total yearly transmission expansions to recent historic build-out rates. Our next scenario is the AC build-out scenario, which builds new AC transmission lines and expands existing HVDC transmission lines within interconnections only. and we no longer have a limit on total annual transmission additions. So we're able to build as much transmission as the model deems is necessary and economic, but we can't cross interconnection seams in this AC transmission framework. Then we move on to our HVDC technology transmission frameworks. The first is the point-to-point scenario, which expands on the AC case study by adding the expansion of existing HVDC interties, which leads to about 195 potential links. This is some of the technology that we've seen deployed a bit here in the US in the past. And lastly is our the higher technology advancement, the multi-terminal scenario that builds new multi-terminal HVDC connections between adjacent regions. And both of these HVDC scenarios were able to cross interconnection seams to go from east to west and down into ERCOT as well. But the multi-terminal has not been deployed in the US, but there's constantly being more traction. So we look at this as more of a potential new technology that we might see in the future. So we tested these 4 scenarios against 3 demand growth scenarios, so a low demand scenario, medium, and high demand scenarios, as well as on 3 emission target scenarios. So one is with no national constraints on carbon emissions, and then we move to a 90% CO2 reduction by 2035 and 100% by 2045. And then our third emissions target is 100% CO2 reductions by 2035, giving us 36 core scenarios. And the goal here is to try to understand the role of transmission across many different possible futures with different demand growth and policies. We then tested these 4 scenarios with the mid-demand growth and the 90% CO2 reductions by 2035 on 15 different sensitivities for resource cost and technology availability. So think limiting the amount of hydrogen expansion that we could have, or limiting nuclear, or more siting constraints on wind and solar generation. And this led to a total of 96 total scenarios that we looked at throughout the NTP study. So we have 6 principal findings to help the readers digest this large technical report that we published within the executive summary. And these 6 principal findings address the role of transmission under current policies, that is no further greenhouse gas reductions based from existing state policies. And the second is the role of interregional transmission in future scenarios where the electricity system is 90% to 100% decarbonized. And lastly, we discuss what needs to happen in the future to capture the full value of interregional transmission capability, regardless of scenario. So getting into our first principal finding, we find that substantial transmission expansion provides the lowest cost US electricity system portfolios that meet future demand growth and reliability requirements. So we find that when you allow the model to expand the transmission system based on economics and finding the lowest cost strategy, it chooses to build over double the current transmission under current policies. So the total transmission system of the contiguous US expands to about 2.1 to 2.6 times the size of the 2020 system by 2050, and interregional transmission grows 2.9 to 3.5 times by 2050. And allowing the system to expand to this greatest extent leads to the greatest total system cost savings, and the amount of transmission expansion scales with the level of electricity demand. So typically higher electricity demand will lead to more transmission expansion. So our next principal finding focuses on the benefits, which we defined as the total system cost savings. And this is really these next three key findings are really the meat of the study, the largest portion of the study, where we analyze the role of transmission in several different future scenarios where emissions are reduced by 90 to 100%. So the first of these benefits is the total system cost savings, which I mentioned earlier, are $270 to $490 billion through 2050. And these incremental investments in transmission are more than compensated by the reduced electric system costs for fuel, generation and storage capacity, as well as other costs. And our next principal finding focuses on the transformative change that we're seeing in the needs for the future of transmission investment. So first is in the amount of transmission investment. So we're seeing the need to double or triple our transmission capacity by 2050, which means doubling our historical investment rates. Second is in the type of transmission. So models are showing that it makes the most economic sense to build HVDC technologies, which are largely not used in the US today, instead of just AC, meaning that the build out of HVDC transmission results in the greatest benefits to consumers across all of the transmission options studied. To get into a bit more detail on this graph on the left here, the model chooses to build multi-terminal HVDC technology as the least cost solution, which we see on the graph in red, as opposed to building AC, which is in green, and point-to-point HVDC in orange, as long as we're allowing it to build that multi-terminal HVDC technology. So finally, in terms of topology, the models are telling us that we need much more longer interregional transmission as opposed to just local or regional lines. And we find that transmission does occur at all scales, but the largest benefits are realized when interregional transmission is the most substantial, including building across the interconnection seams. And I do want to mention here that if we constrain transmission growth, it results in higher cost portfolios because more expensive generation types like nuclear and hydrogen are required when carbon emissions are limited. So in this study, we also looked at reliability, and we define reliability here as resource adequacy, transmission system integrity, and extreme weather resilience. And we find that transmission can play an important role in all of these aspects. When it comes to resource adequacy, we found that in our studies, each of the planning scenarios found to exceed existing industry standards during our resource adequacy analysis. And we also looked at a disaggregated zonal capacity expansion model down to nodal production cost models to further examine regional flows for all hours. And looking at the hour-to-hour variability, we found that these large systems with interregional transmission can be balanced. We can really balance the variability of the load and generation on an hourly basis. We then further translated these production cost models to power flow models to run contingency analysis on the Western interconnection. And we found that the system can maintain integrity even under large typical contingencies. But to focus here on what on the graphic that I'm showing on the slide, we ran 4 different stress cases for extreme weather on the Western interconnection. And what we see here is a combined California heat wave and a Pacific Northwest drought. So what we found is that increased interregional transmission under this extreme scenario actually reduced the amount of unserved energy throughout the event. So we can see from this on the figure on the right, in the limited build-out scenario where we're not allowed to build interregional transmission, there's more unserved energy, as we can see by the darker red, compared to the left, which is the AC scenario where we are allowed to build out interregional transmission with less unserved energy throughout the stress event. So as I mentioned earlier, we also identified high opportunity transmission interfaces. So these hot interfaces represent transmission capacity expansion results between regions across many different scenarios. So these transmission projects, so any sort of transmission projects that align with these hot interfaces could be strong candidates for further study and serve as a starting point for accelerated transmission expansion. And we also identified transmission portfolios here on the right that deliver broad-scale benefits to consumers. And these transmission portfolios were developed using laboratory and industry tools. And these transmission portfolios demonstrate that new interregional transmission combined with intra-regional transmission upgrades can help meet the flexibility requirements of high variable energy power systems. And I want to note that these are potential examples only, and they're not a recommendation or optimal design. And coming up with specific projects to build would have to take place at the regional planning process, in the regional planning process by the utilities. So finally, in our last key finding, I want to highlight that the coordination, accessible data, and new grid modeling approaches must take place for effective regional planning. And the NTP study led to the expansion and creation of tools and methods that transmission planners in the US can leverage for interregional planning. So we made a lot of advancements in several of the lab tools that I've highlighted here. So we have NREL's reads, as well as their production resource adequacy suite, or PRAS, so their capacity expansion and PRAS modeling, as well as their production cost modeling in Sienna, as well as this CPage, or chronological AC powerful automated generation tool developed at PNNL. So all of these can work together to really enhance interregional transmission planning and help planners with the most innovative tools, as well as data development. So these 6 principal findings are supported in technical detail, further summarized in 22 key takeaways, which are outlined further in the executive summary of this study, as well as we also discuss these more in the public webinar. So if you're interested in learning more about those, I highly recommend checking out the webinar again. So getting into the utility of this study. So how is GDO and the DOE going to actually use the National Transmission Planning Study? So right now we're working on sharing the findings and analytical tools developed by the labs with transmission planning entities, RTOs, ISOs, utilities, and the states to help advance planning of interregional transmission. And we also want to encourage the examination by planners of these hot options identified in the NTP study. So to give some more details about the NTP study tools and methods development, as I mentioned, we did a lot of work expanding the capacity expansion modeling. So we did some innovative nationwide capacity expansion modeling. We also push the needle forward with the zonal to nodal model disaggregation. So we took results from the zonal capacity expansion to more detailed system modeling to analyze system cost and operations. And then we also had the chronological AC power flow automated generation, or CPage tool, which samples many timeframes of the year to analyze sequential snapshots to get the most stressed hours of the year to make power flow modeling much more efficient, to really capture some of the more interesting days and stressed hours of the year to do more detailed power flow modeling. And we also did some extreme event and climate change on load modeling to really look at how we can use interregional transmission to potentially increase resilience during extreme events. And some of these tools, we're already working on additional projects here at the Grid Deployment Office in partnership with the labs to to see how we can further improve and find more applicability for these tools. So we find that the biggest hurdle for planning interregional transmission may not necessarily be a technical one, but it's also a policy and a procedural one. And perhaps we can offer technical assistance to help states and regional planners use the methods in the NTP study to implement within or in addition to their existing regional planning processes. So we're looking at potentially building a technical assistance because the study led to the expansion and creation of new and existing transmission planning tools that planners can potentially leverage, such as capacity expansion modeling for scenario development, interregional model development, and looking at potentially extreme events, and development or verification of the best available data, especially in longer term horizons, as well as translating models between different platforms for simulations to help calculate different sorts of transmission benefits. So how does the NTP study fit into some of these other large interregional studies? So last year, we also released, the GDO also released the National Transmission Needs Study, or Needs Study for short. To give a couple of I'm not going to go over all of the differences from the needs study and the NTP study, but I will give a little bit of background on the National Interest Electric Transmission Corridors, or NITSEs, which are maybe designated by the Secretary of Energy in any geographical area that is experiencing or is expected to experience electric energy transmission capacity constraints or congestion that adversely affects consumers. The needs study, along with other information related to electric energy transmission capacity constraints and congestion, serves as the basis for any potential designation of NITSEs. And the NTP study may inform or be used in the next needs study in 2026, but there's no direct link to these NITSEs. And the high opportunities and transmission portfolios in the NTP study can't be directly compared one-to-one with the preliminary list of NITSEs that had been released, but they overall seem to provide some support. So if we're also comparing the NTP study with NERC's Interregional Transfer Capability Study. So GDO staff does serve on the advisory board for the NERC Interregional Transfer Capability Study, or ITC study. Just to give some background on this chart really quick. So these, it's showing that interregional transmission growth for each planning region under each study. So the NERC ITC study, as well as the DOE NTP study for each of the different planning regions. So the NERC study is the blue bars, and the NTP study is these triangles and circles. So the triangles represent the AC transmission build out, and the circles represent the multi-terminal scenarios. And these are the NTP study median results of transmission expansions by 2030. And we didn't include the point-to-point here because it typically falls somewhere in the middle, and the limited transmission paradigm does not have any new interregional transmission. So all of those are zero. So overall, both of these studies do show opportunity for additional interregional transmission, though there are different approaches and end up having different results because of those approaches. And I just want to emphasize here that the NTP study, in the NTP study, the DOE is not recommending a minimum amount of interregional transfer capability. So what we see in this chart is, in general, the NERC results are showing fewer prudent additions than the NTP study median results by 2030. Even if we're just looking at the AC build out. And this is primarily we can see in the western wind belt, or in not the west, in the wind belt in the central of the country, as well as some of the western parts of the country. New York ISO is one anomaly here, but that's because transfers, we're not modeling transfers from Canada, from Ontario and Quebec in these interfaces. And we also, so I want to emphasize some of the differences, reasons for these differences. So the NTP study considers generation type, locations, and dispatch in an economic optimization. So all of the transmission build out and generation build out is co-decided in our capacity expansion model using economics. Whereas ITC is just adding generation to each region to meet reliability reserve requirements. And the NTP study we're based off of all scenarios, which includes our 90% and 100% decarbonization scenarios. So that presumably adds more wind and solar than the NERC ITC study, resulting in higher levels of transmission, especially in areas with high wind potential. So that is all I have today. So thank you for taking the time to listen, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And if you want to reach out to talk about how you can potentially use any of these NTP study tools, or want to learn more, I have my contact information here.
All right, thank you so much, Yamit. That was an excellent presentation. I think a very important body of work. And I know you have some of your colleagues on the call as well. And so we'll jump into some of these questions that were submitted. So you talked about the amount of savings, and it was hundreds of billions of dollars and fairly high BC ratios. Could you talk about the categories of benefits that you looked at, and how do those compare with the 7 benefits that are outlined in FERC Order 1920? And, were there some benefits that were kind of bigger than others? And did that change over time? I realize that's a big question with many pieces there. So pick whichever piece makes the most sense to answer first.
I'll get started here, and then I'll probably ask True from NREL to add any other information. But the primary benefit that we quantified in the NTP study was the system cost benefits. So when we're looking at the BC ratios, that's all from system costs. But we do look more at using our tools that you can suss out the benefits from additional resource adequacy, as well as we can start looking at extreme events, as I talked about earlier. But I don't know if True wants to add information about resource adequacy or other benefits.
Yeah, thanks, Yamit. The underlying framework, as Yamit explained, is this co-optimized generation and transmission, and looking at the system as a whole. So intrinsic in that, those system cost savings included both kind of fuel and variable costs reductions, as well as capital cost savings. And what we do see over time is initially it's more operating cost savings, and then transitioning over to capital cost savings in the end. And part of that, and one of the key findings here, is the transmission's role in resource adequacy, and providing a resource adequate system at lower costs was one of the main drivers of transmission. So with respect to FERC 1920, I think the 7 benefits, most of the major ones we captured, some of them like the extreme weather events, we did some case study analysis to start looking at them and demonstrating how the tools and data that can be used to evaluate them. Overall, beyond those benefits, looking at 1920, the NTP study applied a lot of the approaches that 1920 calls for. For example, long-term, 20+ year planning, multiple scenario analysis, and the like. There are some things, of course, we didn't do, such as grid enhancing technologies and some other elements there.
All right, thank you, Yamit. Thank you, Chair. The next question is talking about the results, and this question is characterizing it as fairly high level and directional results. And so you can comment on on that if you think it is fairly high level. But the other part of the question is, how are you thinking you will take these results, the findings, the approaches to help RTOs, ISOs, transmission planners, developers use the methods that you have developed here? How will you be able to transfer some of that knowledge to help them evaluating projects and identifying needs?
Yeah. So the transmission interfaces that we identified, they are fairly high level. They're not going into specific bus to bus new transmission lines. They're really just intended as a starting point. We can see that there's potentially a lot of benefits going from this area in MISO to potentially this area in PJM or SPP. So I definitely agree that they're high level. And what we're aiming to do now is having discussions with ISOs and RTOs on what they potentially need, as well as coming up on our own of different sorts of technical assistance. We're brainstorming that here right now of like, how can we take these tools to potentially apply them to, if we're trying to come up with, do capacity expansion modeling with different scenarios, like can we partner with an ISO and RTO along with the labs to figure out what exactly scenarios are they interested in, and a lot of interaction between the labs who have developed these tools and the ISOs and RTOs, and how can they actually be either part of or ancillary to their existing planning processes. So it's going to take a lot of conversations at this point going forward to figure out what exactly everybody needs and how we can apply these tools.
Thank you. Even though you're characterizing the findings and the paths as fairly high level, could you talk about the amount of detail that actually went into the studies? I know you did hundreds of scenarios and simulations. So even though the findings are high level, could you say a little bit about everything that went in to coming up with those findings?
Yes, True, do you want to take this question?
Yeah, I think this is one of the complexities that went into it, as Yamit showed in terms of the different tools and models. I think we all appreciate that we don't have one model that could rule them all, that could handle all the different various aspects. So, it's starting from that more high-level capacity expansion model at the zonal level is kind of the foundation that all those other tools are built to link on and then evaluate more detailed aspects. So we did look at hundreds of scenarios using that. We did use a resource adequacy model to evaluate all those scenarios for all years, and that uses multiple years of kind of hourly chronological data to look at thermal outages in a probabilistic sense to see if we have an adequate system. We did translate several of these scenarios into the nodal world to do detailed production cost unit commitment modeling on, as well as power flow analysis, and stress them. So it's that full suite of model, and some of the nodal analysis in particular relied on the industry planning cases that we've partnered with our stakeholders here to get the best available data, looking at constraints along individual lines and substations and whatnot. So hopefully that gives a sample of it, James.
All right, thank you. And so jumping off of that, could you talk a little bit about what the benefits are of merging siloed planning processes and grid models, which is something that I think you did in this study in a way that hasn't been done in many other places. So could you talk about that, just going across the silos of transmission planning?
I'll start and maybe turn it over to some others, and you please feel free to jump in. I think one of the things that is unique here is we did look at a co-optimized generation and transmission process, which would yield a different, and other studies have indicated a more optimal solution than looking at sequentially the generation problem first and the transmission problem. But maybe I'll see Yamit if you wanted to respond, and also my colleagues Jared Wright at NREL and Nader Samad at PNNL could jump in here.
I'll hand this over to Patrick if he wants to provide some input.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to say that, like Yamit emphasized at the beginning of her presentation, the existing planning methods are a little bit balkanized in the US. And so if you're in one region and you're trying to do your resource planning and come up with the best solutions, you might not be looking into other regions to see what resources are available. There might be more economic options to build a transmission line and get your resources from your neighboring region rather than building resources in each region. So in the NTP study, we really see a lot of benefits to, linking the regions and sharing the resources, not just for energy sharing, but also for capacity reserve sharing. And I think that that piece of the interregional resource planning aspect needs to be integrated into transmission planning to really get the most benefits out of the whole system. And that's kind of the piece that we're missing out of our, localized individual regional planning efforts. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Patrick. There's another question about some of the assumptions that went into the study. Did the load scenarios assume the same growth across the country, or were combinations of varying growth levels in different regions included in the various scenarios?
Yeah, I think.
I'll take this one. Thanks, Yamit. So we did not assume kind of a diversity of load growth within a single scenario. We looked at 3 different levels of load growth that are broadly consistent across the different regions. There's some variation, but they were broadly consistent. But in coming up with those scenarios, we did work with different planning entities around the country to look at how they're viewing load growth for their region. And broadly speaking, our 3 load growth scenarios did match the range, and there is quite a diverse range of at least anticipated load growth at the time. One of the things to note on our higher demand growth scenarios did include a lot of winter demand growth that exceeded summer demand peaks. So they did also reflect kind of a shift towards winter peak, which did vary between the regions. Obviously, the more northern latitudes and the colder regions, or those that already rely on electric heating in particular, had a higher prevalence of winter peaking. So we did capture some of those dynamics.
Thank you. We have quite a few more questions here, and we have about 10 minutes to go, so we'll see how many we can get through. Could you talk about the implications of constraining transmission growth and the need for either nuclear, hydrogen, carbon capture, as we're kind of looking out at this decarbonized future and the trade-offs between these technologies? So as you either constrain or allow transmission to grow, what impact does it have on the need for the other technologies?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, if you constrain transmission growth, it tends to increase cost because you'll need more of the expensive generation like nuclear or hydrogen or carbon capture. Whereas when you expand transmission, we're able to take advantage of lower cost resources and to take advantage of the geographic diversity that each of these generation resources has to offer.
Great, thank you.
And maybe if I could add to that, James, briefly, I think some of the high level cost savings that Yamit presented were those that, or in our core scenario, In the sensitivity set, we did look at a lot of scenarios without the availability of some of these newer technologies, like new nuclear, like carbon capture, like hydrogen. And those benefits of transmission that we found were even greater under those cases, sometimes by significant measures. So in some ways, transmission offers a hedge against some of these technology uncertainties, is another kind of sub-benefit that we found.
Great, thank you. A question about your capacity expansion and your starting point. Did you include projects that are already in the interconnection queues? Or did you have some different starting point? And I assume the same question can go for transmission as well. Did you look at projects that were, in development, things that are in ISO RTO plans? What was your starting point for generation and transmission?
Maybe I'll start on the generation side, and then others could jump in on the transmission, especially in the nodal scenarios where we did, examine kind of existing projects. But on the generation side, we didn't include projects that were in the queue. We do have some in our databases that are under construction, and we included those for the near-term years in particular. In many of these scenarios, the amount of expansion, for some technologies, were beyond what's in the queue because they had higher load growth than perhaps what people expected, a few years ago. And we did look at pretty deep levels of emissions reductions as well. Subsequently, we have incorporated some of the information from the queues into our model, but for the NTP on the generation side, we did not include it. For transmission, we didn't allow kind of new transmission builds until the 2030 and beyond period to deal with some of the lag times associated with transmission. But maybe I'll defer to Jared Wright in how the existing transmission proposed projects are incorporated or in our nodal scenarios.
Thanks, Drew. So specifically on transmission, existing projects were included as defined by various stakeholder consultations that we went through across all of the interconnects. So trying to establish some of those that are either under construction or confirmed as to being built. But beyond that, we didn't necessarily include anything further in terms of transmission expansion, merchant investments that were a bit more uncertain in the nodal models. But a lot of the time what starts to happen is when expanding the nodal transmission on the basis of some of these futures, a lot of those start to pop up in terms of similar types of transmission needs. And although, as you mentioned, we don't necessarily try and identify individual projects, we start to see similar types of flows across similar types of interfaces across each of the interconnects.
Great, thank you. See if we can get two last questions in here. One about HVDC. It clearly played a big role in your findings and in your study. But there's a question about the long lead times and supply chain and manufacturing. Does the study talk about that at all? And there are ways to address that growing need through the DOE or the other avenues?
Yeah, so the NTP study did not address supply chain or the long lead times for HVDC, and that is definitely, it's a challenge I think we're all thinking about. And I think, yeah, so I think this is a problem that still needs to be solved, unfortunately, not within the NTP study, so can't really speak too much to that.
All right, thank you. Let's see if we can get one or two more in here before we wrap up. So you talked about a number of outputs from the study. There is the report itself, but there is tools, maybe data as well, and processes that have been developed through this. How can folks get access to that? Is it reaching out directly to you? Is that saved somewhere in some central repository? How can folks get access to some of those tools and materials?
So if you're interested in these tools and materials, if you just shoot me an email, I'd be happy to connect you with the right folks to get the right information to you. There's some stuff available. I know NREL released a scenario viewer to look at some of the data more closely. I don't. That's public information, but I can definitely provide that link as well.
Great, thank you. And there's a question I'll read out here. Val 003 frequency response obligation is based on a loss of 4,500 megawatts. Are these proposed ties greater than that? And did you test the impact on frequency response?
I'll defer to True or Nader on the size of the ties, but we did not do some of the more dynamics or frequency response analysis. We just did a typical steady state contingency analysis to see how the system responded, and I think that is, and this the frequency response is definitely something everybody's concerned about, and I think it's something that we've been thinking about at DOE and potentially addressing.
Yes, so we consider some of those big lines like contingencies up to 3,000 megawatts and the Western interconnection for some of these new lines. And just steady state, no dynamics, and same story with generation outage to see which units will be able to recover or provide the needed generation that for the amount that get lost, which we found storage will play a key role in that. But we are currently analyzing further a case in the Western interconnection, will go all the way to dynamic analysis to build all the dynamic data for wind and solar and run actual frequency response analysis, so that maybe it will be available in a few months from now.
All right.
In the planning, the capacity expansion work, we did have proxies to account for contingencies in how we, allow the interfaces or the amount of interfaces across given the amount of transmission that is built and whatnot. But again, it's, steady state ish, and it was not really intended to do kind of a full frequency analysis, but we're partially there.
All right, thank you. I could ask another question, but I'm afraid that would get us past the top of the hour. So I think we'll start wrapping up here. So I want to thank you, Yamit, and your colleagues. Thank you so much for the really informative presentation. And for everyone that was on the call, I hope you found something useful from this. And there's links to the full report, which has a lot of detail that is quite the read, and I really encourage everyone to read through the report. As I mentioned earlier, we'll send an email out once the video file has been posted, and the other questions that were asked and we didn't get to, we'll ask the presenters to provide responses to those. Again, we really appreciate your engagement, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Again, further information from all our webinars and meetings can be found on our website at www.esig.energy under events, and in our newsletters and informational emails. You're all invited to attend these different meetings. Yamit, again, thank you so much for this very timely, informative webinar. And thank you all for your interest. Look forward to seeing you again. Have a good rest of your day.